Welcome to Histrology, where history meets royalty.
The echo of centuries still clings to the marble corridors where the Habsburgs once walked. Corridors carved not only from stone, but from ambition, alliances, and a bloodline stretched to its very limits. Before their empire fractured, before their legacy became a puzzle for future generations, the Habsburgs believed they had mastered the art of survival. Kingdoms rose and fell, crowns changed hands, but the name Habsburg clung stubbornly to the map of Europe like an ancient root, refusing to die. Yet beneath this grandeur simmered a truth the world would only understand centuries later. The dynasty's greatest power was also its slow, silent undoing. The story begins not with their golden age, but with the fragility hidden beneath their royal veneers. The secret, quietly etched into their portraits, whispered in foreign courts, and recorded in the meticulous genealogies of Europe. The bloodline was folding in on itself. The earliest chroniclers didn't need medical training to notice something was wrong. The Habsburg faces changed with every generation, becoming more pronounced, more exaggerated. A long jaw, a heavy lower lip, a strange imbalance that sculptors struggled to idealize. Painters softened what they could, but even they could not mask the truth entirely. The Habsburg visage was evolving into something uncanny. But to understand what it meant, you must first step back into the very heart of their strategy. A strategy crowned with alliances, sealed with marriages, and repeated until it became tradition. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It was a philosophy that allowed the Habsburgs to expand without armies, gain without bloodshed, and climb to the apex of European power. Yet, with every marriage between cousins, uncles, nieces, distant relatives turned dangerously close, the foundations beneath their empire began to crack in ways no emperor could see. Inside the imperial courts, people whispered that the Habsburgs were blessed, chosen by destiny, protected by God, and guided by centuries of royal blood. But destiny had its own rules. The more the dynasty tightened its grip on a pure Habsburg lineage, the more fragile that lineage became. By the time their empire reached its height, the dynasty wasn't just ruling Europe, it was fighting itself, cell by cell, generation by generation. Each heir was not merely born with royal blood, but with the weight of centuries of genetic repetition. Some children thrived, others did not. Some heirs appeared strong and charismatic. Others carried the silent marks of the dynasty's breeding path. Developmental challenges, weak immune systems, facial distortions, and medical mysteries the physicians of their time could not explain. But no tragedy symbolized this fragile bloodline more than the story of the last Habsburg king of Spain. Charles II, the monarch whose very existence became the turning point in the dynasty's fate. Charles was born into a world expecting greatness. His birth was celebrated with fireworks, prayers, and a sense of relief that the dynasty had secured another male heir. But from the moment the midwives saw him, they knew something was wrong. His tongue was too large for his mouth. He struggled to swallow. He was sickly, silent, and unsettlingly fragile. Royal physicians reassured the family that he would grow stronger, that his issues were temporary. But the truth shadowing his childhood was unmistakable. Charles was the living proof of the Habsburg centuries. Old experiment, an experiment stretched past its natural limits. He learned to walk late, to speak even later. He struggled to chew food, often drooled, and frequently fell ill. Scholars say he looked decades older than he actually was, his bones fragile like winter branches. The more Europe watched him, the more they realized something unthinkable. The most powerful dynasty in the continent had produced not a king, but a warning. His ministers hid his weaknesses, his advisors manipulated him, and foreign powers circled like wolves sensing the end of an era. The Spanish court, once a symbol of Habsburg glory, had become a labyrinth of factions fighting over a king who could barely rule. But behind the politics, behind the wars about to erupt over Spain's throne, stood one haunting question, one that future generations would endlessly debate. Did the Habsburg bloodline die with him? Or did it slip silently into new branches, new names, and new destinies? Because while Charles II stood as a tragic symbol of the dynasty's genetic decline, the Habsburg family was far from simple. Their lineage was vast, complex, and spread like vines across every noble house in Europe. If one branch withered, did it truly mean the end? No one in the Spanish court could answer that. But deep in the imperial archives, records told a different story, one that historians would spend centuries piecing together. And so, as the torch in the Habsburg palace burned lower, and the last Spanish Habsburgs struggled to hold on to life, a darker, more mysterious tale began to unfold, one that questioned everything Europe believed about bloodlines, succession, and legacy. Did the dynasty collapse? Or did it simply evolve into something the world failed to recognize? The answer lay buried in the marriages, the secret branches, the forgotten cousins, and the political bargains written in faded ink. And that journey into the heart of a bloodline, both powerful and perilous, was only just beginning. And precinct, long before the world questioned whether the Habsburg bloodline had truly ended, clues were already scattered across Europe. Little threads woven into marriage registers, forgotten diaries, secret correspondences, and portraits that hid more than they revealed. These fragments told a story far bigger than the fall of a single monarch. They pointed to something stranger, more contradictory. The dynasty that appeared to die might never have died at all. But to understand this, one must return to the centuries before Charles II, to the time when the Habsburgs stretched their influence like an invisible hand across kingdoms. Across kingdom. For every emperor who sat on a dazzling throne, there were cousins, uncles, daughters, nephews, sent quietly into courts all over Europe, planted like seeds into foreign dynasties. These marriages were not accidents. They were strategies, carefully calculated, quietly executed. And they created hidden branches of the bloodline that historians would only rediscover centuries later. The Austrian Habsburgs, those who ruled the Holy Roman Empire, had always been aware that their line was dangerously intertwined. Unlike Spain, Austria's branch had managed to keep its heirs healthier, stronger, perhaps because of occasional marriages that diluted the gene pool, or perhaps because fate had not yet turned against them. But even in Vienna, the whispers of fragility echoed. Physicians noticed mild versions of the Habsburg jaw in children. Some princes struggled with respiratory illnesses, others with brittle bones, and many with the same quiet ailments that doctors could not diagnose. Yet the courts pretended everything was normal. Royal portraits were retouched. Artists softened the jawline, thinned the lips, narrowed the chin. Painters knew their survival depended on portraying the dynasty not as it was, but as it wished to be remembered. While Spain was breaking under Charles II, Austria looked stronger, more stable. The emperors there fathered many children, spreading alliances across Europe like a network of living threads. Archduchesses married into France, Poland, Bavaria, Tuscany, Modena, Parma, and countless German principalities. Princes wed duchesses whose ancestry connected to ancient houses and rising powers alike. It was in these marriages that the true puzzle began. Their bloodline was alive, but their empire was dying. And as the 20th century approached, waves of tragedy washed over the dynasty. Assassinations, suicides, illnesses, and political disasters carved scars deeper than any genetic weakness. One tragedy, however, would shatter the empire's future more than any other. The death of Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Franz Joseph, the heir meant to carry the Habsburg name into a new age. His suicide in Mayerling did more than break the emperor's heart. It broke the dynasty's direct male succession. From that moment onward, the Habsburg fate turned from fragile to fatal. But even as their world spiraled, the question that haunted Europe remained. If the empire fell, did the bloodline fall with it? Or was the fall merely political, while the lineage continued quietly, invisibly, woven into the veins of modern royal families and ordinary people alike? Because in dusty cathedral records, medical journals, and family trees tucked away in European estates, something fascinating began to reveal itself. Traces of the Habsburg bloodline existed everywhere, not in the obvious places, not in the famous heirs, but in the forgotten marriages the daughters married abroad, the illegitimate sons raised in military academies, the cadet branches folded into newer dynasties. The Habsburg name may have faded, but the Habsburg blood was far from gone. And as the empire marched toward its final collapse, the world had yet to discover just how deeply this ancient bloodline had embedded itself into the fabric of Europe. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the House of Habsburg, once the continent's unshakable power, found itself standing at the edge of a world it no longer recognized. Steam engines thundered through cities. Revolutions flickered like wildfire. New ideologies replaced old loyalties. Empires that once commanded millions were reduced to fragile symbols of fading glory. But inside the vast halls of Vienna and Budapest, where chandeliers still glowed with the arrogance of old power, the Habsburgs clung to their traditions. Their bloodline, though diluted from centuries of strategic marriages, remained a symbol of something ancient, something almost mythical. And yet, even as their courts held on to their past, the dynasty was walking toward its greatest collapse. The death of Crown Prince Rudolf, Franz Joseph's only son, was the first wound that refused to heal. His suicide at Mayerling in 1889 shattered not just his father, but the entire empire. The tragedy removed the one heir who represented modernity, education, political liberalism, a new direction the dynasty desperately needed. In Rudolf's absence, the next heir became Franz Joseph's nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was stubborn, unpredictable, and famously married for love rather than strategy, union the court despised. His choices marked a deviation from the centuries-old Habsburg blueprint. He married Countess Sophie Chotek, a noble but not royal woman, causing tension throughout the court. The empire tolerated them, but only barely, yet history had far darker plans. On a quiet morning in June 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, a series of decisions, some careless, some fated, brought Franz Ferdinand and Sophie face to face with a pistol aimed by a young man, chosen by history for reasons he himself barely understood. 2 gunshots echoed. A world collapsed. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand triggered the First World War, and with it, the final unraveling of the Habsburg political power. The empire fractured under the weight of war, nationalism, and exhaustion. When the conflict finally ended, the dynasty that had once controlled vast territories across Europe was reduced to a single truth. The Habsburg Empire was dead. But was the bloodline? While the world focused on the fall of their empire, the family itself quietly continued, scattered, diminished, stripped of titles, but still bound by the name that had once ruled Europe. Emperors were no longer emperors. Archduchesses became ordinary women with extraordinary ancestry. Heirs who once commanded armies now stood in line at border checkpoints, pleading for visas like ordinary travelers. After the war, the last reigning emperor, Charles of Austria, fled into exile with his wife, Zita of Bourbon-Parma, and their children. Charles would die young, leaving Zita a widow at just 29, with 8 children who carried the full weight of centuries of Habsburg legacy without the power that once protected it. It was in these children that the bloodline's survival, or end, would be decided. The eldest son, Crown Prince Otto von Habsburg, became the symbolic heir of the dynasty. He lived not as an emperor, but as a statesman, intellectual, and advocate for European unity. Otto's life was a strange contrast to his ancestors. He could not rule, but he could influence. He could not wear a crown, but he carried the legacy of one. He could not command nations, but he could shape their future through diplomacy. Otto represented the final transition from a world of bloodlines and empires to a modern world of parliaments and elections. But he also represented something deeper. The Habsburg bloodline was still alive, changed, humbled, but breathing. His siblings scattered across Europe, forming alliances with old noble families, marrying into houses that once feared the Habsburg name. Through these unions, the bloodline stretched into modern Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, Germany, and even non-royal branches whose names carry no hint of the empire they descend from. But another question emerged, one far more mysterious. What about the traits? The jaw, the illnesses, the fragile history? Did they survive as well? Medical historians have long debated this. Some claim the Habsburg jaw resurfaced mildly in a few modern descendants, though softened by generations of genetic dilution. Others argue it disappeared almost completely after the Habsburg-Lorraine merge. Studies show mixed evidence. While the facial traits were strong in portraits of the old dynasty, they became subtle or vanished in the generations that followed. Maria Theresa. It appears the bloodline survived, but the signature that defined their face slowly faded, as if history itself was smoothing it away. Yet the blood, biologically, genealogically, continued. While Austria and Hungary abolished their monarchy, and while the world imagined the dynasty dead, their descendants quietly lived on. Engineers, authors, diplomats, professors, philanthropists, activists. One branch settled in Switzerland, another in Belgiumburg. Some even emigrated to Latin America, creating distant Habsburg threads far from Europe. None ruled, but all carried the legacy, and through them the bloodline remained unbroken. It was no longer a dynasty of emperors, but a lineage of survivors, adapted, modernized, hidden in plain sight. And yet, the world clung to the idea that the Habsburgs had ended. Why? Because the empire ended. Because the crowns were gone. Because without castles, armies, and ceremonies, people believed the bloodline itself had vanished. But the truth, when traced through genealogical trees and DNA evidence, reveals something astonishing. Nearly every major royal house in Europe today carries Habsburg ancestry through Maria Theresa's children and their descendants. Spain, Belgium, Luxembourg, the United Kingdom, Italy, even distant branches of France. The Habsburg name may have faded, but their blood flows through modern Europe like a silent river. And hidden among these modern royals are traits, tiny echoes of a dynasty that once ruled continents. But the story doesn't end there. Because beyond the official descendants, beyond the noble families, lies the question no historian can answer with absolute certainty. Did any secret, forgotten, or unofficial branches survive, carrying the bloodline outside the boundaries of royalty? Old letters, unrecorded marriages, and obscure military archives hint at possibilities. Branches disconnected from titles but connected by blood. Some might live today as ordinary citizens. Some may have no idea of their ancestry. And some historians suspect are closer to the original line than modern royals themselves. The world believes the Habsburg lineage ended with an empire, but the empire died. The bloodline did not. What died was the crown, not the genes, not the legacy, not the descendants who carry the ancient thread into the 21st century. Yet one final chapter remains, one last circle of truth that answers the question the world keeps asking. If the Habsburg bloodline survived, did it survive intact? Or did it splinter into new identities that no longer resemble the dynasty of old? To uncover that, one must turn to the very end of the story, to the last official heirs, their modern lives, and the extraordinary, unlikely way the Habsburg bloodline exists today. The 20th century brought unprecedented change. 2 world wars, the collapse of empires, the rise of republics, and a world no longer ruled by kings and emperors. For the Habsburgs, these transformations were cataclysmic. Palaces emptied. Crowns vanished and centuries of political influence dissolved like mist over the Danube. Yet beneath this collapse, the dynasty endured in a form that was invisible, quiet, and almost miraculous. The last emperor, Charles I, died in 1922, exiled and forgotten by many. His widow, Zita, carried the family forward with determination, raising their children with dignity and a strong sense of purpose despite the loss of empire. They were no longer rulers, they were custodians of history. Among these children, Crown Prince Otto von Habsburg became the central figure in preserving the bloodline. Living most of his life in exile, he traveled Europe tirelessly, maintaining the family's heritage and connections. He embraced modernity, engaging in European politics, advocating for unity and striving to preserve a legacy that was no longer defined by throne or title, but by influence and survival. Otto married Princess Regina of Saxe-Meiningen, further intertwining the Habsburg blood with other noble houses. Through their children, the Habsburg lineage extended quietly into modern Europe, connecting the family to contemporary royalty while continuing the biological thread of the dynasty. Yet it wasn't just about political marriages, it was about survival. Pure, relentless, and biological. The blood that had once defined emperors now coursed through grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and distant relatives, unnoticed by the world but undeniable to genealogists who traced family trees with meticulous care. Modern Habsburg descendants have lived as private citizens, often blending into the tapestry of Europe rather than standing out as monarchs. Some pursued careers in diplomacy, others in academia, the arts, or philanthropy, yet all carried within them the genetic legacy of centuries of kings and queens. Even the signature Habsburg Jaw, once exaggerated and infamous, has softened through generations, a subtle reminder of history rather than a mark of curse or tragedy. The illnesses that plagued the Spanish Habsburgs no longer dominate the lineage. Careful marriages and the infusion of new blood diluted their effects. What remains is resilience. The Habsburgs survived centuries of political intrigue, genetic peril, and social upheaval. The dynasty may have lost its empire, but the bloodline proved enduring, adapting to a world that no longer required emperors to survive. Yet the fascination with the Habsburg bloodline continues. Historians, genealogists, and enthusiasts still trace the sprawling family trees, marveling at how a single lineage could stretch across Europe, survive wars and exile, and quietly embed itself into the modern aristocracy. From Spain to Belgium, Austria to Luxembourg, fragments of the Habsburg blood flow through living descendants. Even today, whispers circulate of distant, lesser-known branches, forgotten cousins, cadet lines, and unofficial descendants, carrying the genetic thread into unexpected corners of the globe. It is a story that challenges the very idea of extinction. The Habsburg bloodline did not vanish with crowns, kingdoms, or empires. It transformed, survived, and in a sense became immortal, not as a political force, but as a living legacy hidden in the veins of those who may never know they are heirs to one of Europe's most powerful dynasties. The question of did it die thus finds its answer in a paradox. The Habsburg Empire is gone. The Habsburg political power is gone, but the bloodline lives. It lives in the children of Zita and Charles, in the descendants of Maria Theresa, in the scattered branches that reached across Europe through centuries of strategic marriages. It lives in subtle traits, in enduring genetics, in the quiet resilience of a family that weathered history's storms. And perhaps most importantly, it lives as a reminder. Dynasties are not merely about crowns or thrones, but about the fragile, enduring thread of blood, legacy, and survival. The Habsburgs may have vanished from palaces, but they never truly vanished from the world. They exist hidden in plain sight, a living testament to the power of lineage, the endurance of blood, and the secrets history sometimes chooses to conceal. The bloodline that once shaped Europe now shapes its memory, quietly continuing its journey through time, forever entwined with the history it once ruled.